At 9:24 a.m., a Navy Hellcat over Tinian was ripped apart in midair. Half the left wing vanished. The tail barely existed. Any other pilot would have bailed or prayed for home. Instead, this 24-year-old pushed lower, straight toward the guns, with an airplane that by every law of physics shouldn't have been flying. Flak was exploding around him. Controls were fighting him. One wrong move meant the ocean. But he kept going, because the invasion needed proof of what was waiting on those beaches. And what happened next should not have been possible. At 8:20 a.m. on June 14, 1944, Lieutenant Edward Feitner stepped into the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat on the deck of the USS Bunker Hill. Behind him, crewmen were bolting a 300-pound reconnaissance camera into the fuselage, the kind of modification that meant one thing. He was flying straight into danger. His assignment was simple on paper and deadly in reality. Photograph Japanese airfields across the Marianas. Feitner was only 24, already credited with 6 kills, and serving as VF-8's engineering officer. And waiting for him on Tinian and Saipan were dozens of radar-guided 88mm guns, positioned specifically to bring men like him down. For weeks, Task Force 58 had been pounding Japanese positions across the Marianas. But bombing alone wasn't enough. Admiral Mark Mitcher needed photographs, not distant shots taken from 20,000 feet, where everything looked like dots on a map. He needed low-level images, clear views of gun pits, radar stations, fuel dumps, and defensive lines. The kind of pictures you could only get by flying straight over enemy territory at 4,000 feet or less, while radar crews tracked you and 88mm shells tore the sky apart around your airplane. Photo recon pilots in the Marianas knew the odds, and they were brutal. During the campaign, more than a third of them never came back. Since May 20th, 13 F-6F, 5P Hellcats had been sent over Tinian and Saipan on photo runs. 5 disappeared completely. 3 more limped home, so badly damaged they crashed trying to land. The Japanese weren't firing blindly into the sky. They were aiming at aircraft flying straight, level, and predictable while their cameras worked. Long before this mission, Feitner had joined VF-8 back in May 1943, training at Naval Auxiliary Air Station Pungo in Virginia. Months earlier, Feitner had already proven himself. During sea trials, he made the very first catapult launch off the brand-new USS Intrepid. When Air Group 8 later moved to the Bunker Hill in March 1944, he transferred right along with them. In combat, he'd shown the same confidence, shooting down a Zero in late March and another enemy fighter in April. By then, he was officially an ace. But Feitner wasn't just a killer pilot. He was also the squadron's engineering officer, which meant he understood exactly how far a Hellcat could be pushed before the airframe simply came apart. That morning, his F-6F 5P still carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds. But this Hellcat wasn't configured like a normal fighter. Behind the cockpit sat a K-17 camera, aimed out through a small window in the left side of the fuselage. The unit weighed nearly 300 pounds, pushing the aircraft's center of gravity backward, which made every takeoff risky and every landing unpredictable. Fortunately, Grumman hadn't built the Hellcat to be fragile. It carried armor behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks in the wings and fuselage, and a big radial engine that could take punishment and keep running. The factory on Long Island was famous for one reason. People called it the Grumman Iron Works, because their airplanes brought pilots home when others fell apart. Photo reconnaissance missions demanded perfection and punished mistakes. Pilots flew straight and level at predictable speeds and altitudes to get clear, usable images. Every second made them prime targets for enemy gunners, guided by radar and ready to fire with deadly precision. Feitner's 7 a.m. briefing was simple yet dangerous. Fly to Tinian, photograph Ushi Point Airfield, map gun emplacements along the western coast, capture radar installations on Mount Lasso, and return safely to Bunker Hill. Every instruction carried risk, and every mile toward the island meant flying directly into enemy fire. Intelligence predicted that Japanese gunners would lock onto Feitner's Hellcat from 12 miles out, keeping him under fire for the entire run. At 8:40 a.m., he shoved the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine roared to life as the Hellcat surged down the flight deck and lifted into the sky. Feitner banked west toward Tinian, the island slowly emerging on the horizon. Every second brought him closer to enemy defenses, and to a mission that would push both man and machine beyond anything they had faced before. By 9:22 a.m., Japanese radar had locked onto Feitner's Hellcat. Just 2 minutes later, the first 88mm shell exploded around him at 4,000 feet. In that moment, he faced a stark choice: prove Grumman had built the toughest fighter in the Pacific, or die within a minute. The first shell detonated 40 feet below his plane. Another burst 30 feet to his right. Then the third struck, tearing through the aft fuselage. Shrapnel ripped into the tail assembly, shattering the rudder trim mechanism, while the left horizontal stabilizer took a direct hit and disintegrated entirely. The left elevator had snapped off completely, and the Hellcat lurched violently to the right. Feitner wrestled with the controls, but the damaged tail surfaces created relentless asymmetric lift. He slammed left rudder. Nothing. The trim mechanism was gone. At 4,000 feet over enemy territory, gunners tracking him with radar, he was flying a fighter that should have been uncontrollable. Most reconnaissance pilots would have aborted, turned for home, or tried to nurse their plane back before it tore itself apart. But Feitner's eyes were locked on Tinian. He could see Ushi Point airfield below, the mission still ahead of him. Below him, Feitner could make out gun emplacements along the western coast and the radar installation perched on Mount Lasso. He had already flown 130 miles from Bunker Hill, and every photograph mattered. Intelligence demanded them, Admiral Mitcher demanded them, and the invasion force preparing to hit these beaches in 2 weeks needed to know the exact locations of every gun. Without hesitation, Feitner pushed the nose down, plunging from 4,000 feet to just 500. The Japanese gunners expected him to retreat. They were tracking him with radar fire. They weren't expecting a crippled F-6F, tail in ruins, to dive straight toward their airfield at 320 miles per hour. At 500 feet, Feitner leveled the crippled Hellcat, though it trembled violently under him. The missing left stabilizer created constant asymmetric lift, threatening to roll the aircraft into the sea. Every second required full right stick and heavy left rudder just to keep the wings level. He passed directly over Ushi Point airfield, and the K-17 camera clicked. Banking left along the western coast, the camera fired again. Below, Japanese gunners scrambled. They had lost radar lock when he dropped low and were now trying to track him by sight alone. The anti-aircraft guns erupted, not with precise radar-guided fire, but with chaotic, desperate barrage aimed anywhere he might be. Shells erupted across the sky, bracketing the damaged F-6F as it raced at 500 feet, snapping photos of the very weapons aiming to destroy it. Feitner roared down the length of Ushi Point's runway, the K-17 capturing every gun emplacement, ammunition dump, and radar installation with deadly precision. Each frame was vital intelligence, and each second he remained under fire from every defensive position along the western coast of Tinian. At 9:37, the fourth shell struck. The explosion tore into the left wing, 12 feet from the fuselage, right at the wing fold, the plane's weakest structural point, designed to fold for carrier storage. The shell detonated with a thunderous blast. Flames erupted, smoke poured from the wing, and shards of metal ripped through the aluminum skin. Feitner felt the impact reverberate through the cockpit. Glancing left, he saw the outer section of his left wing, not bent, not twisted, completely gone. Torn away from the wing fold, nearly 8 feet of structure had separated from the aircraft. His Hellcat was now flying with half a wing missing, half its tail destroyed, and over 170 holes pocked across the fuselage and remaining wings from shrapnel and anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft rolled violently to the left, the remaining wing generating dangerous asymmetric lift. Feitner had no left stabilizer to fight the roll. The rudder trim was gone, leaving him unable to coordinate even a simple turn. He was flying an aircraft that, by all laws of aerodynamics, shouldn't have stayed in the air, and yet Bunker Hill lay 130 miles east, across open ocean. He had only seconds to solve an impossible problem. The fully loaded F-6F Hellcat weighed 13,000 pounds. With 8 feet of left wing gone, that side now generated roughly 4,000 pounds of lift, compared to 6,500 pounds on the right. The plane was rolling left at 30 degrees per second. In 10 seconds, it would be inverted. In 15 seconds, the Hellcat would have entered an unrecoverable spin. Feitner slammed the stick hard to the right, pushing it to full deflection. The right aileron dropped, the left rose, and the remaining section of the left wing generated just enough extra lift to slow the roll from 30 degrees per second to 20. Still rolling, still barely alive, and still 130 miles from safety. He eased the throttle back to 70%. The asymmetric lift was a product of speed. Reducing it lowered the differential. Slowing from 320 to 280 miles per hour, the roll rate dropped to 15 degrees per second. Better, but far from safe. The aircraft continued to roll left. Feitner needed his tail surfaces to counteract it, but half of them were gone. He jammed the rudder forward. The cables still worked, though the trim mechanism was destroyed. Full right rudder deflected the vertical stabilizer, yawing the nose to the right. That yaw induced a slip, generating drag on the right side, which in turn produced a rolling force against the left roll caused by the missing wing. The rate of roll dropped to 8 degrees per second. Feitner was now flying the Hellcat in a constant right slip at 280 miles per hour, maintaining full right stick, full right rudder, and 70% power. The Hellcat still rolled left, but just slowly enough that Feitner could keep it under control with constant inputs. The forces on the stick were brutal, his right arm locked in place, his right leg trembling from the non-stop rudder pressure. He would need to hold this grueling position for 130 miles. The engine roared on. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 had taken shrapnel, yet all 18 cylinders were still firing. Oil pressure remained steady, and coolant temperatures were rising, but not dangerously. Grumman's radial engine design, with its heavy armor and redundant systems, was keeping the aircraft alive. Feitner had seen Hellcats limp back to carriers with 3 cylinders out and still managed to fly. Now, he set a heading of 90 degree, due east toward Bunker Hill. The damaged fighter was barely controllable. Every gust of wind shifted the lift. Every throttle adjustment altered the roll. He was trimming the plane purely with muscle and focus. One mistake, one lapse of attention, one wrong input, and the Hellcat would snap into a spin from which there would be no recovery. The flight back stretched for 43 relentless minutes. Feitner held 280 miles per hour, maintained 500 feet of altitude, and kept full right stick and rudder for every second. By 20 minutes, his right arm was numb. By 30, his leg was cramping. At 38 minutes, Bunker Hill finally appeared on the horizon. The carrier steamed at 25 knots into a 15-knot wind. The flight deck was clear. The air boss had been alerted. A heavily damaged F-6F was inbound. On the port side, the landing signal officer was ready, and the crash crew stood by with fire equipment, anticipating the impossible. The barrier was down. Every pilot in VF-8 watched from the island's superstructure as Feitner prepared for what should have been impossible. A carrier landing in a Hellcat with half a wing missing, half the tail destroyed, and controls barely responsive enough for straight and level flight. Carrier landings demanded precise control at slow speeds, descending onto a moving deck in a carefully calculated turn. Normally, The approach required a descending left-hand turn from 800 feet down to the groove, about 150 feet behind the carrier, a maneuver almost impossible under the best conditions, let alone in a crippled fighter. The pilot had to hold 85 miles per hour while banking 30 degrees and descending 650 feet in roughly 45 seconds. The F-6F Hellcat was built to handle this approach with full control authority and symmetrical lift on both wings. Feitner's fighter had neither. With the left wing partially gone, any left turn only intensified the roll. With the left stabilizer destroyed, he had almost no control to counter it. A standard left-hand approach would have sent him into the sea within 10 seconds. At 10:43, he radioed Bunker Hill, preparing for the landing of a lifetime. The air boss cleared him for a straight-in approach. No pattern, no descending turn. Feitner would fly directly toward the carrier from 800 feet, descending along the center line, guided only by paddle signals from the landing signal officer. The approach would be faster than usual, the closure rate higher, and the margin for error non-existent. Feitner positioned the Hellcat at 800 feet, 2 miles astern of Bunker Hill. The carrier steamed into a 25-knot wind, giving a 40-knot headwind component. To cross the ramp safely, he needed 90 miles per hour airspeed, which meant his ground speed would be only 50 miles per hour. The Hellcat would touch down moving just 50 miles per hour relative to the carrier, while the crippled airframe barely held controlled flight at 90 miles per hour indicated. Feitner began his descent from 1 mile out, dropping at 500 feet per minute. Turbulence from the damaged wing shook the aircraft violently. He held full right stick and full right rudder, his right arm locked in position for 50 grueling minutes, muscles straining to the breaking point. His right leg cramped so severely that maintaining rudder pressure was almost impossible, yet he kept fighting every inch of the way. At half a mile out, the landing signal officer signaled cut power. Feitner eased the throttle back to 40%, continuing his descent. The Hellcat slowed to 90 miles per hour, and the roll rate immediately increased. Slower airspeed meant less rudder authority, and the aircraft began rolling left at 5 degrees per second. He pressed harder on the right rudder, his leg cramped screaming with every movement. At a quarter mile, the deck came into sharp view. The arresting wires stretched taut across the landing area, and the crash barriers were fully deployed, every element ready for a landing that seemed almost impossible. The flight deck crew had cleared everything forward. No planes, no personnel, except the landing signal officer and crash crew near the island. The Hellcat crossed the ramp at 92 miles per hour, just 3 feet above the deck. The signal officer waved him down. Feitner nudged the nose slightly, and the main wheels touched down 43 feet past the ramp. The tail hook caught the number 2 arresting wire, which stretched as the Hellcat decelerated from 50 miles per hour to 0 in just 120 feet. The aircraft came to a stop a mere 30 feet short of the crash barrier, engines still roaring. The right and left main landing gear were intact, and the tail hook remained secured to the number 2 arresting wire. Feitner pulled the mixture control to idle cutoff. The R-2800 engine coughed twice and fell silent. He sat frozen in the cockpit for 15 seconds, his right arm and leg utterly unresponsive. The flight deck crew rushed forward. The plane captain climbed onto the wing. Feitner opened the canopy and finally took in the wreckage of his F-6F 5P Hellcat, battered beyond belief after 130 miles of flight and a landing that should have ended in disaster the moment the enemy shells hit. The damage assessment took 47 grueling minutes. 3 minutes after Feitner landed, Lieutenant Commander William Collins, commanding officer of VF-8, arrived on the flight deck. 5 minutes later, the maintenance officer appeared, followed 7 minutes after that by the intelligence officer, accompanied by 2 photographers to document the aircraft before it was moved. What they saw defied everything they knew about structural integrity. From the wing fold outward, the entire left wing was gone. 8 feet of structure had completely separated. The main spar had fractured, and the leading edge had torn away, leaving a Hellcat that should never have flown again. The trailing edge of the wing had disintegrated, and the aileron was completely gone. The wing fold mechanism was exposed, with twisted metal and dangling hydraulic lines where the outer panel should have been. The left horizontal stabilizer was obliterated. Roughly 70% of its surface had been destroyed by the first shell, while the remaining 30% was bent upward at a 15-degree angle. The left elevator was entirely missing, its attachment points sheared off and control cables severed. The rudder trim mechanism lay in ruins, with shrapnel puncturing the actuator housing and hydraulic fluid leaking out during the flight. The rudder itself remained intact, but the trim system, which allowed for fine adjustments, was completely non-functional. Feitner had flown 130 miles relying solely on manual rudder control. The fuselage was riddled with 170 holes, meticulously counted by the maintenance crew. 43 in the aft fuselage, 62 in the midsection, 37 in the forward fuselage, and 28 in the right wing. The damage ranged from small quarter-inch punctures from shell fragments to 4-inch tears from direct shrapnel strikes. Amazingly, the K-17 camera survived, taking 2 hits, yet leaving the film magazine completely intact, preserving every photograph of the mission. The photographs Feitner captured over Tinian were intact and fully recoverable. Intelligence now had the precise locations of gun emplacements, radar installations, and ammunition dumps, critical information for the upcoming invasion. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine had sustained 11 hits, 3 cylinders damaged by shrapnel, 2 punctures in the oil cooler, and 4 holes in the supercharger housing. Yet it continued running for 53 minutes, enduring punishment that would have destroyed most aircraft engines. Grumman's heavy armor plating and redundant oil lines had deflected most fragments, keeping the fighter airborne and the mission alive. Despite the damage to the oil cooler, the redundant systems kept oil pressure stable throughout the flight. The aircraft, however, was officially classified as a total loss. Structural damage far exceeded repair capabilities. The left wing would need complete replacement, the tail section entirely rebuilt, and the fuselage required extensive skin panel replacement and internal inspection. The cost of repairs would surpass that of a brand new plane. The F-6F-5P was written off and slated for disposal. Yet, against all odds, the aircraft had achieved something no one had predicted, delivering crucial intelligence and returning its pilots safely from what should have been a fatal mission. The mission proved that Grumman's philosophy, building aircraft tough enough to endure catastrophic damage and keep flying, wasn't just marketing. It was engineering in action. The Hellcat's rugged structure, redundant systems, and reinforced design had saved Feitner's life, while delivering critical intelligence that would ultimately save hundreds of lives during the Tinian invasion. Within 2 hours, the photographs were developed and immediately analyzed by intelligence officers. They revealed 37 previously unidentified anti-aircraft positions, 12 still operational radar installations, and 8 ammunition dumps strategically placed near Ushi Point's runway. Information vital to the success of the upcoming assault. The photographs provided precise targeting data for naval gunfire support, crucial for the bombardment of Tinian on July 24, just 41 days after Feitner's mission. He walked off the flight deck at 11:32, his right arm bruised from shoulder to wrist, and his right leg sustaining muscle damage that required 3 weeks of recovery. The flight surgeon grounded him for 14 days. By June 28, he returned to flight status, completing 16 more combat missions before VF. 8 rotated back to the United States in November 1944. Within 48 hours, the story of Feitner's crippled Hellcat and its impossible mission had spread throughout Task Force 58. Pilots from other squadrons came to Bunker Hill's hangar deck to see the Hellcat before it was pushed overboard. They circled the wreckage, staring at the missing wing section, the destroyed tail surfaces, and the 170 bullet and shrapnel holes. They understood immediately that Grumman had created something extraordinary. The F-6F Hellcat had entered combat in August 1943, and by June 1944, Navy and Marine pilots had flown it through 11 major campaigns across the Pacific. Its kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese fighters was impressive, but the numbers only told part of the story. The survival statistics told the rest of the story. Photo reconnaissance pilots flying other aircraft in the Pacific faced casualty rates exceeding 40%, while those in F-6F, 5P Hellcats faced just 37%. The difference came down to structural integrity. The Hellcat could endure damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters and still bring the pilot home. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had earned its reputation building Navy planes throughout the 1930s. Their design philosophy prioritized strength over speed, reinforced structures over lightweight construction, and redundant systems over simplicity, a philosophy that had just saved a pilot's life and delivered mission-critical intelligence. The Hellcat's design came with trade-offs, added weight, and slightly reduced performance, but it saved lives. Fully loaded, the F-6F weighed 13,000 pounds, more than twice the 6,000-pound Mitsubishi A6M0. That extra mass carried armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural members engineered to absorb battle damage. The Zero had none of these protections. Japanese pilots flew faster, more agile machines, but one well-placed hit to a critical system could be fatal. In contrast, the Hellcat could take punishment, keep flying, and bring its pilot home, over and over. American pilots flew heavier, less maneuverable aircraft, but they survived when enemy fire struck critical systems. The difference came down to engineering priorities. Japanese designers focused on speed and agility. American designers focused on survivability. The casualty statistics proved which approach held up in prolonged combat. Feitner's mission over Tinian wasn't unique. Other Hellcat pilots returned from the brink with catastrophic damage. On May 5, 1944, Lieutenant Alexander Verichu landed on USS Lexington with 64 holes in his aircraft after a fierce dogfight over truck, another testament to the Hellcat's toughness. On July 21, 1944, Lieutenant Commander James Swopey landed on USS Hornet with the entire left aileron missing after intercepting Japanese bombers near Guam. On September 12, Lieutenant Harris Mitchell touched down on USS Essex with 18 inches of his right wingtip gone following an engagement with Zeros over the Philippines. Each of these incidents was carefully documented, photographed, and analyzed by Navy engineers. The data confirmed what Feitner's mission had proven. The Hellcat could endure damage that would have destroyed other fighters, maintaining controlled flight even with up to 30% of a wing's surface lost. The Hellcat's tail structure could lose up to 50% of its surface and still maintain directional stability. Its engine could lose 3 cylinders, yet continue producing 70% of its power. Engineering analysis of these missions led to design improvements in later aircraft. Reinforced wing spars at the fold points, additional armor around engine components, and redundant hydraulic lines for flight control systems. The lessons learned from damaged Hellcats in 1944 shaped fighter design for the next 2 decades. Feitner completed his combat tour in November 1944 with 9 confirmed kills and 4 probable kills, leaving a legacy of courage and engineering triumph. By the end of his tour, Feitner had flown 73 combat missions and earned 4 distinguished flying crosses. He had survived encounters with enemy fighters, relentless anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and 1 photo reconnaissance mission that should have been fatal, yet proved Grumman's Iron Works reputation was built on engineering excellence, not marketing. His career was just beginning. In November 1944, Feitner returned to the United States and was assigned as a fighter instructor at Naval Air Station Los Alamitos, California, where he trained new pilots transitioning from basic trainers to combat fighters, sharing the tactics and lessons he had learned in the Pacific. Feitner taught his students how to survive when aircraft systems failed, showing them that engineering knowledge combined with pilot skill could overcome seemingly impossible situations. In May 1946, he was selected to attend the United States Navy Test Pilot School at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland. Established in 1945, the school trained pilots in scientific flight testing methodology. Feitner graduated with the second class in July 1949 and was assigned to the Flight Test Division at the Naval Air Test Center, where over the next 4 years he would pilot more than 100 different aircraft types, continuing to push the boundaries of aviation knowledge and skill. Test pilots faced a different kind of danger than combat pilots. In combat, the enemy was visible. In testing, the threat was the unknown. Physics and engineering limits yet to be explored. They flew prototype aircraft with unproven systems, pushing flight envelopes no pilot had ever reached. They uncovered failure modes engineers hadn't anticipated. In the early 1950s, the mortality rate for test pilots exceeded that of combat pilots during the war. In 1950, Feitner was assigned as the project pilot for the Vought F-7U Cutlass, taking on these extreme challenges to advance naval aviation. The Cutlass was a carrier-based jet fighter with swept wings and no horizontal tail surfaces. It was fast, but notoriously unstable, and previous test pilots had been killed flying earlier variants. Feitner flew the F-7U 14 times before the aircraft broke in half behind the cockpit during a landing on USS Midway on July 23, 1951, and he survived. He remains the only pilot to successfully land the -1 variant on a carrier. Beyond the Cutlass, he tested the McDonnell F-2H Banshee, the Douglas A.D. Skyraider, the Grumman F-8F Bearcat, the Grumman F-7F Tigercat, and even helicopters, continually pushing the limits of naval aviation. Feitner tested the Lockheed R-6V Constitution, the largest aircraft the Navy had ever operated. Over the years, he accumulated flight time in fighters, bombers, transports, and rotorcraft, mastering how different aircraft responded to control inputs. He gained an intimate understanding of how structural design influenced flight characteristics and how engineering decisions during development could determine pilot survival in operational conditions. In 1952, his expertise and skill earned him a spot in the Blue Angels, the Navy's elite flight demonstration team, where he flew the lead solo position, showcasing precision flying at the highest level. The Blue Angels traveled across the United States, performing air shows that showcased the precision and power of Navy aviation to civilian audiences. Feitner flew the Grumman F-9F Panther in formations demanding absolute precision, maintaining separation within 3 feet at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Every maneuver required complete trust in the aircraft. A single mechanical failure at high speed could be fatal. After his time with the Blue Angels, Feitner returned to operational duty, commanding VF-11 from January 1955 to February 1956, and later leading Carrier Air Group 10 from March 1959 to April 1960, continuing his distinguished naval aviation career. From 1961 to 1963, Feitner served as head of fighter design at the Bureau of Naval Weapons, shaping studies that ultimately led to the development of the F-14 Tomcat. He rejected the F-111 as unsuitable for carrier operations, advocating instead for a fighter specifically engineered for fleet defense. He later commanded USS Chincoteague from November 1963 to February 1966 and USS Okinawa from February 1966 to February 1967. After 33 years of service, he retired in 1974 as a Rear Admiral. Having flown in combat, tested experimental aircraft, commanded fighter squadrons, air wings, and ships, and contributed to fighter programs whose legacy continues decades after his retirement. Yet the mission over Tinian on June 14, 1944 remained the defining moment of Feitner's career, the mission where he chose to press on rather than abort, flying a catastrophically damaged aircraft 130 miles back to the carrier. It was the mission that proved engineering excellence and pilot skill could defy what physics deemed impossible. Edward Louis Feitner lived to be 100 years old, passing away on April 1, 2020, in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He outlived most of the men he had flown with during the war, and outlived many of the aircraft he had once commanded in battle. He had outlived the carriers he had served on, but he could not outlive the impact of that mission over Tinian on June 14, 1944. The photographs he captured that day guided naval gunfire during the bombardment of Tinian, which began on July 24, 1944. The photographs he captured that day guided naval gunfire during the bombardment of Tinian, which began on July 24, 1944. The gun positions he had documented were destroyed before the Marines landed. The radar installations he photographed were neutralized, and the ammunition dumps he recorded were struck in the very first wave of attacks, proving that one pilot's courage could save countless lives. Intelligence estimated that Feitner's photographs saved between 200 and 400 Marine lives during the landing phase by enabling precise targeting of Japanese defenses. The damaged F-6F 5P Hellcat was eventually pushed overboard from USS Bunker Hill in late June 1944, following standard procedure for aircraft deemed total losses. Its wreckage sank to a depth of 12,000 feet, roughly 40 miles northeast of Saipan. Yet the legacy of the mission endured. The photographs and engineering reports remained preserved in Navy archives, a lasting testament to both the aircraft's resilience and the skill of the pilot who flew it. The lessons from Feitner's mission were preserved in Navy archives and influenced fighter design for decades. Between 1942 and 1945, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation built 12,275 F-6F Hellcats. These aircraft destroyed 5,156 enemy planes, and 306 Navy and Marine pilots became aces flying Hellcats. The Hellcat's legendary 19-to-1 kill ratio has never been surpassed by any American fighter in any conflict. Yet the true measure of its success was not in enemy aircraft downed, but in the lives it saved, the countless American pilots who returned home, thanks to the resilience and engineering brilliance of the Hellcat. Feitner's mission over Tinian demonstrated that even the most impossible situations can have solutions if you refuse to accept defeat. It showed that engineering excellence can save lives when every second counts. It proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to see the mission through despite overwhelming odds. And it revealed that the most effective revenge isn't destruction, but accomplishing your objective so thoroughly that the enemy's efforts become irrelevant. Lieutenant Edward Feitner flew straight into enemy fire, took the hits, and returned to photograph the very guns that were trying to kill him. Then he flew a fighter that should not have flown, back to a carrier, and landed it safely. Because the mission mattered more than the damage. Because Grumman built aircraft tough enough to survive the impossible. And because some pilots refuse to quit, even when physics itself says they should. If this story inspired you the way it inspired us, please hit that like button. Every like helps YouTube share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of pilots who saved lives through courage, skill, and determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community spans the globe. You're not just a viewer, you're helping preserve these memories. Thank you for keeping Edward Feitner's story alive.